Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. We're exploring An Introduction to Criminological Theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In today's deep dive, Chapter 5, we turn our attention to the biological roots of crime and examine how biology has shaped, and sometimes distorted, our understanding of criminal behavior.
That's right. This chapter dives deep into the predestined actor model, specifically the idea that some people are somehow predisposed to crime by their very nature, focusing today on the biological variant.
Yeah, the biological side of things.
We're essentially tracing the history of biological positivism, the attempt to use scientific methods to find the biological causes of criminal behavior.
And it's quite a journey, isn't it? Starting with some foundational, often really uncomfortable early ideas,
Definitely uncomfortable.
and moving through attempts to link crime to genetics, body types, brain function, and even the body's chemistry. Our mission, pulling only from the source material presented in this Chapter 5, is to really unpack these core arguments.
Yeah, look at the evidence offered.
And critically, its limitations.
Crucial point. Explore the criticisms. And most importantly, grapple with the significant and often deeply unsettling implications of trying to explain something as complex as crime purely through biological factors.
Exactly. And we'll do that by walking you through the key figures and concepts, mostly following the historical path the chapter lays out.
We'll pull out the details, the source highlights, connect ideas across different approaches, but always keeping firmly within the bounds of what this chapter tells us. No outside stuff.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
Okay.
Let's jump right in then. The story of biological positivism, as this chapter tells it, really kicks off in the late 19th century with what's known as the Italian school.
And the big names here are Cesare Lombroso, Enrico Ferri, and Raffaele Garofalo. What really set them apart, and it was pretty revolutionary at the time, was their core belief that criminology shouldn't just be philosophical or purely legalistic.
Right, not just armchair theorizing.
Exactly. They argued it needed to be a scientific study focused squarely on the criminal person themselves, studying the individual.
Now, the source is pretty candid about their methods and early findings, isn't it? Describing them as potentially appearing simplistic or even laughable today.
Laughable is a strong word, but yeah, looking back, some of it seems quite crude. But it's crucial to understand, as the chapter points out, that they really did establish an enduring tradition. Later researchers built on what they started, making it much more sophisticated over time.
So they laid the groundwork, even if the initial structure was a bit shaky.
Precisely. And the starting point, the figure most synonymous with this early phase, is Cesare Lombroso, who was a psychiatrist and a prison physician.
Okay.
His groundbreaking work, L'Uomo Delinquente, or On Criminal Man, published way back in 1875, is where we find his central, most significant idea.
Which is the really striking claim that criminals are a distinct physical type compared to non-criminals. They weren't just normal people doing bad things. They were, well, biologically different somehow.
Exactly. He introduced this concept of degeneracy and, maybe most famously, atavism.
Atavism, like evolutionary throwbacks.
That's exactly it. Criminals, in his view, represented a form of degeneracy, essentially, a biological stepping back in evolutionary terms. He saw them as throwbacks to earlier, more primitive forms of human or even pre-human life.
And he wasn't vague about this either. He thought he could actually see these signs of degeneracy, these physical markers of criminality.
Oh yeah, the source lists some pretty specific examples he looked for. Ears of unusual size, sloping foreheads, excessively long arms, receding chins, twisted noses, that kind of thing.
So for him, these were like the biological fingerprints of a criminal nature.
That's how he saw it. Now, the chapter does add a bit of nuance here. It says that in later editions of his work, Lombroso did start to expand his views somewhat.
Oh, really? How so?
He began giving more consideration to environmental factors, things like climate, poverty, immigration, urbanization.
Okay, so acknowledging the social context a bit more.
A bit more, yes.
Yeah.
But even with that evolution in his thinking, he's primarily remembered for this bold, biological, positivist claim about the born criminal type.
He didn't just lump all our criminals together based on looks, though, did he? The source mentions he had categories.
Right. He developed a classification system, dividing criminals into 4 main categories based on his observations. First, you had the born criminals.
These were the ones identified solely by those physical, atavistic characteristics, the throwback.
Exactly. Then you had the insane criminals. This was a broader category, including individuals with conditions we'd recognize today, like Idiocy, imbecility, paranoia, epilepsy, or alcoholism. He grouped those together.
Okay, that makes some sense. What was the third group? This one sounds interesting.
It is interesting. It seems to kind of bridge the gap between this biological view and the rational choice ideas. These are the occasional criminals, or criminaloids.
Criminaloids, okay.
They commit crimes when presented with an opportunity, much like someone acting purely rationally might. But, and this is the crucial biological twist for Lombroso, he believed they possessed innate traits that predisposed them to actually take those opportunities when they arose.
Ah, so it wasn't just about the situation, there was an internal push as well, like a vulnerability.
Precisely. A biological vulnerability, you could say.
Yeah.
It made them susceptible to temptation. And his final category was criminals of passion, those driven by strong emotions like anger, love, or honor.
The source also mentions his views on female offenders were, well, pretty limited.
Yeah, very limited. He gave them little specific attention, apparently. Saw their criminality mainly as restricted to things like prostitution and abortion.
And remarkably, he thought it was invariably instigated by men, completely overlooking economic necessity or anything else.
Seems so.
What?
Just disregarding other potential motives. And unfortunately, as the source notes, this stereotypical and narrow view was quite influential for a time.
Looking back, the critique of Lombroso's methodology in the chapter is pretty sharp. Primitive, limited data.
Yeah, primitive is the word used. Very limited data. Simplistic statistics. And a major flaw highlighted was his lack of a guiding theory to meaningfully organize his observations.
How so?
Well, he kind of started by assuming offenders must be different. Then he observed that they were different among themselves, and he just created categories based on those observed differences. It wasn't really theory-driven in the way we'd expect now.
But even with these significant flaws, the source identifies 3 lasting contributions Lombroso made, things that changed the field.
Yes, important contributions despite the issues. First, he really shifted the focus away from abstract legal or moral arguments towards the scientific study of the criminal individual, trying to be objective.
I say, bringing science to the table.
Second, despite his methods being flawed, he showed the importance of looking at clinical and historical records when studying offenders, using actual data, even if his analysis was basic.
Right.
And perhaps most crucially for the future, he recognized the need for multi-factor explanations. He acknowledged that factors beyond just biology, including hereditary, social, cultural, and economic influences, played a role.
And that idea was really picked up by his successors, wasn't it?
It was. Which brings us neatly to Enrico Ferri. He's presented as a key figure who expanded on Lombroso's ideas, but definitely moved beyond a purely biological explanation.
So broadening the scope.
Significantly. Ferri argued strongly that criminal behavior resulted from the interaction of a whole range of factors, not just one type. He tried to categorize these factors into 3 broad groups.
What were they?
Physical factors like race, geographic location, temperature. Then individual factors such as age, sex, psychological makeup. And finally, social factors, including population density, religion, culture, economics. A much wider net.
And unlike Lombroso, who seemed more focused on just identifying the criminal type, Ferri used this broader view to propose some pretty radical ideas for crime control.
He did. Based on his analysis, this multi-factor view, he advocated for improving the social conditions of the poor. He suggested measures like subsidized housing, birth control, public recreation facilities, things aimed at prevention through social reform.
That sounds quite progressive, especially for the time, linked to his politics.
Yes. The source notes this strong focus on social improvement reflected his socialist political views, tackling root causes in society.
Interestingly, the chapter also mentions his later interaction with Mussolini's fascist state. That seems like a clash of ideologies.
It does, and it's a complex point. He was actually invited to draft a new penal code for the regime in the 1920s.
Really? How did that work out?
Well, ultimately, his positivistic approach, which sought explanations in all these multiple interacting factors, was rejected. It was seen as too significant a departure from the established legal framework, which was still heavily based on the rational actor model, the idea of free will and individual responsibility.
So his scientific, multi-factor approach didn't fit the legal mold.
Exactly. And the source cites an observation by Sellon suggesting Ferri was attracted to fascism partly because it reaffirmed state authority, something he apparently favored over what he saw as excessive individualism. Bit of a paradox there.
Okay, the third key figure of the Italian school mentioned is Raffaele Garofalo. He was an academic and a lawyer.
That's right. Garofalo developed this doctrine of natural crimes. His view was that society is a kind of natural body, and certain behaviors are intrinsically criminal because they violate the law of nature. Essentially, criminal behavior was unnatural behavior.
Okay, natural crimes. But how did he figure out what this law of nature actually dictated? What was natural or unnatural?
He believed the rules of right conduct were revealed through reasoning just by thinking logically about what should be allowed or prohibited for a society to function. He identified acts that he felt no society, regardless of its specific laws, could possibly avoid recognizing as criminal and needing punishment. These were the universal, natural crimes.
And he linked these natural crimes to the violation of two basic human sentiments, according to the source.
Yes, he argued that in advanced civilized societies, two basic moral sentiments were pretty much universal: pity and probity.
Pity and probity. Can you break those down?
Sure. Pity is basically the feeling of revulsion against causing voluntary suffering to others. Empathy, not wanting to harm people. And probity is respect for the property rights of others. Honesty regarding possessions.
He seemed to have a bit of an elitist view of morality, too, didn't he? Like some people were just inherently better.
He did, apparently. He suggested that some members of society were just inherently superior, possessing a higher sense of morality than others. And conversely, he argued that true criminals lacked these properly developed altruistic sentiments, pity and probity.
And this deficiency wasn't just learned, he thought it could be passed down.
Yes, these psychic or moral anomalies, as he called them, were something he believed could be inherited, a biological flaw in moral capacity.
And just like Lombroso, he also created categories for criminals based on these deficiencies.
He did. His 4 categories were based on which sentiment was lacking, or both. First, you had murderers. He saw them as totally lacking in both pity and probity. They'd kill and steal whenever they got the chance, in his view.
Okay, completely deficient. What about the others?
Then he had categories for lesser criminals. Violent criminals lacked pity, but he did acknowledge they could be influenced by environmental factors like alcohol, or if crime was just endemic in their community.
Right.
Thieves suffered from a lack of probity, but this condition, he thought, might be more a product of social factors. And finally, sexual criminals were a bit complex. Some were grouped with violent ones if they lacked pity, but others needed a separate category because their actions stemmed from a low level of moral energy rather than a complete absence of pity.
It's fascinating how, even within this one school of thought, they had such different ideas about what should be done with offenders. Lombroso leaning towards treatment.
Right. Lombroso, with his medical background, tended to see criminals as diseased individuals who needed treatment, change, maybe reintegration.
But Garofalo took a much harder line.
Much harder. He saw criminal behavior as a fundamental failure of the sentiments necessary for social life. So his logical and pretty harsh conclusion was elimination for the sake of societal survival.
Elimination meaning?
Things like life imprisonment or overseas transportation for lesser offenders. Basically, removing them permanently from society.
And the source highlights a really troubling shared aspect between Garofalo and Ferri related to expertise and rights.
Yes, this is a critical point. It points out that both of them were apparently prepared to sacrifice basic human rights to the judgment of scientific experts. These experts' decisions, based on their scientific assessment of the criminal, would supersede the individual's rights or even public opinion.
Wow, so science trumps rights.
That was the implication. And this willingness to subordinate individual liberties to perceived scientific authority is precisely what made their ideas acceptable or even attractive to the Mussolini regime in Italy.
Because it gave a kind of scientific legitimization for an authoritarian state, one built on ideas of national strength, racial purity.
Exactly. It provided a seemingly objective justification for potentially oppressive policies. And the source spells out the chilling logic inherent in the tradition Garofalo and Ferri represent. If you truly believe an incurable criminal type exists, and that science can reliably identify this type, well, the logical solution becomes their permanent isolation or removal from society.
And taken to its extreme.
This logic could even suggest intervening before someone commits an offense, based purely on their perceived biological predisposition. Pre-crime intervention based on biology.
That really underscores the point that treatment in this context isn't necessarily a soft or benevolent option.
Not at all. The source strongly emphasizes that treatment here can have much more sinister connotations, leading to significant infringements on civil rights. It suggests that, despite their own flaws, later biological theories might be considered preferable simply because they haven't fully embraced these extreme penological conclusions of elimination and pre-crime intervention that you see hinted at here. It's a very dark side to this early positivism.
Okay, so if the Italian school laid that somewhat disturbing foundation, the next major phase seems to be the idea that criminality itself could actually be inherited, passed down through families.
Right. This concept gained momentum, and researchers started trying to test it using different methods. They moved into studying families with histories of crime, comparing twins, and examining adopted children to try and tease.
Start with those early criminal family studies. They seem linked to older concerns about heredity and social problems like poverty and feeble-mindedness.
They do. The source mentions the work of Dugdale back in 1877. He studied the Jukes family, tracing over 700 members and finding a large proportion were criminals or relied on public assistance.
And Godard did something similar with the Kallikak family.
Yes, Godard's 1914 study of the Kallikak family traced about 480 members and also found a significant number with criminal records. A key finding highlighted from both these early studies was the observed link they made between criminality and what they termed feeble-mindedness.
Feeble-mindedness, like low intelligence.
Essentially, yes. After the development of IQ tests, inherited feeble-mindedness was actually proposed as a principal cause of crime for a while. It later went out of fashion, only to make a problematic comeback later, which we'll get to.
Goring's 1913 study is presented as a more sophisticated attempt to tackle this heredity question, though.
Yeah. Goring's study was more rigorous for its time. He compared 3,000 convicted prisoners to a control group of non-criminals. His findings. He concluded that prisoners were, on average, physically smaller and inferior in mental ability compared to the controls.
Okay, physical and mental differences. But what about the heredity link?
Crucially for the heredity argument, he found strong statistical associations in criminality between parents and children and also between brothers. That suggested a family link.
Right.
But here's the key part. He then looked at children who had been separated from their criminal parents early in life and raised elsewhere. He found they were as likely or even more likely to become criminals compared to those who weren't separated.
And his interpretation of that was?
Since contact with a criminal parent wasn't necessary for the child to become criminal, he argued, inherited characteristics must be the primary source, not environmental factors like learning criminal behavior from the parent.
Makes a certain kind of sense, but the source points out some major weaknesses in his study, right?
Big weaknesses that really undermined his conclusions. First, he didn't adequately measure the environmental effects in the homes where the separated children were actually raised. What if those homes were also disadvantaged in ways that contributed to crime, regardless of the child's biological parentage?
Good point. What else?
Second, his comparison was too simplistic. It assumed that the influence passed from parent to child was solely about learning criminal techniques. It completely ignored the broader transmission of values, norms, attitudes toward authority, things like that.
Right, the social learning aspect.
And third, his study only included male criminals. That's a problem for a general heredity argument, unless you believe criminality is somehow sex-linked, because otherwise females should be affected similarly if it's purely genetic.
So these weaknesses really highlighted the need for better methods to try and separate nature from nurture.
Which leads us to twin studies.
Exactly. Twin studies became the classic method for trying to untangle this nature versus nurture puzzle.
Can you quickly recap the logic behind them?
Sure. It's based on the genetic difference between identical or MZ twins and DZ twins. MZ twins come from a single fertilized egg, so they're genetically identical. DZ twins come from two separate eggs, so they share about half their genes, just like ordinary siblings.
Okay.
The core idea is that if MZ twins show significantly more similarity in a trait, like having a criminal record, than DZ twins do, that extra similarity must be due to their shared identical genetic makeup, assuming, and this is a big assumption, that their shared environment is roughly similar for both types of twins.
Lange's 1930 study is cited as an early influential example.
Yes. Lange examined 30 pairs of male twins, where at least one twin had a prison record, 13 MZ pairs, and 17 DZ pairs. He found a criminal concordance rate, meaning both twins had a record of 77% for the identical MZ twins. Wow, 77%. What about the fraternal twins?
For the fraternal DZ twins, the concordance rate was only 12%, and for ordinary brothers, it was even lower, around 8%. So based on that stark difference, Lange concluded that heredity played a major part in criminality.
A later, much larger study was done by Christensen in Denmark, wasn't it, in 1968?
That's right. Christensen looked at over 6,000 pairs of Danish twins using official crime registers, a much bigger data set. He found a criminal concordance of 35.8% for MZ male twins and 12.3% for DZ male twins.
Still a significant difference, though lower than Lange's numbers.
Lower, yes, but still statistically significant. He also noted that the concordance rates were higher for both types of twins when considering more serious offenses.
But the source raises a really important question about these findings. What exactly is being inherited here? Is it a crime gene?
That's a key problem acknowledged in the chapter. Twin studies can suggest a hereditary influence, but they don't clarify if it's a specific predisposition to crime or maybe just a more general personality trait like impulsivity or low self-control that makes crime more likely under certain conditions.
Right, it's not necessarily a direct inheritance of criminality.
Exactly. For instance, the twins in Lange's study didn't always commit the same types of offenses, which suggests maybe a general vulnerability rather than a specific inherited criminal pattern.
Christensen, the Danish researcher, seems to have been more cautious in his conclusions than Lange was.
He was. He definitely didn't claim heredity was the only factor or even the dominant one. He saw twin studies more as a way to understand the complex interaction between the environment and biological traits.
He even looked at urban versus rural differences.
Yeah, he used differences in concordance rates between urban and rural settings to suggest that the environment might actually be more influential in complex urban environments. So more nuance.
However, the central criticism of twin studies still remains, doesn't it? The environment problem.
It's the big one. It's incredibly hard to truly separate the effects of shared genes from the effects of a shared environment. MZ twins, because they look identical, are often treated more similarly by parents, teachers, peers. They might share clothes, friends, hobbies, experiences to a much greater degree than DZ twins.
Which could explain why they're more similar in behavior, completely separate from genetics.
Exactly. That shared experience could explain their higher concordance rates for criminality, regardless of their identical genes. It's called the equal environments assumption, and it's a major challenge for twin studies.
And there were even conflicting findings within twin research itself, like the Dalgaard and Kringland study mentioned.
Right. In 1976, Dalgaard and Kringland studied 139 pairs of male twins with convictions in Norway. They found MZ concordance at 25.8% and DZ at 14.9% again, a difference. But here's the crucial part. When they statistically controlled for the level of psychological closeness between the twins, how much time they spent together, how similar their friends were, etc., they found no significant difference in concordance rates anymore.
Wow. So their conclusion was?
Based on that, they concluded that hereditary factors were not significant causes of crime. The similarity was due to the shared environment and closeness.
But then other researchers, Cloninger and Gottsman, looked at the same data and disagreed. How does that happen?
Well, they reanalyzed it with different assumptions. In a review, they argued that if Dalgaard and Kringland were right, that environment explained the similarity, then MZ twins who were very close should be more similar in their criminal behavior than MZ twins who were less close. Since this wasn't observed in the data, Cloninger and Gottsman reached a different conclusion, arguing it actually supported a genetic influence. It shows how interpretation matters.
It really does. More recent work, like the Rowe and Rogers study, seems to try and find a middle ground between pure nature and pure nurture.
Their 1989 self-report study of 308 twin sets used questionnaires rather than just official records. Their conclusion was that both inherited characteristics and environmental explanations are supported by the data.
How did they reconcile that?
They suggested inherited traits might contribute to some initial similarity between twins, but the ongoing interaction between the siblings and their environment can actually cause twins who were initially different, discordant, to become more alike, concordant over time. They still acknowledge the inherent difficulty in completely separating heredity and environment when twins grow up together.
Which is precisely the difficulty that adoption studies were designed to overcome.
Exactly. The methodological goal of adopted children studies is to create a situation where the influence of biological parents, the source of genes, can be more clearly separated from the influence of adoptive parents, the source of the primary environment.
How do they try to achieve that?
By looking at children who are adopted away from their biological parents very early in life, ideally with little or no contact afterwards. Researchers hope that any statistical association found between the criminal behavior of the adoptee and their biological parent could be attributed to inherited factors with greater certainty, because the child hadn't shared the biological parent's environment.
The source mentions a significant study by Hutchings and Mednick using data from Copenhagen. What did they find?
They looked at male adoptees. They found that 48% of the adoptees who had criminal records also had a birth father with a criminal record.
Okay, nearly half. How does that compare?
Well, compare that to only 31.1% of adoptees without criminal records who had a birth father with a record. That difference suggested a genetic link.
Did they look at the adoptive parents too?
Yes, and this is interesting. They also found that an adoptee was even more likely to end up with a criminal record if both their birth father and their adoptive father had convictions. That points towards an interaction effect.
Genes and environment working together.
Potentially. And in a comparison study where they directly compared a sample of adoptees with criminal records to a control group of adoptees without, the link to biological parents seemed particularly strong.
How strong?
In the criminal adoptee group, significantly higher percentages had criminal biological parents compared to the control group. Specifically, 49% of criminal adoptees had criminal birth fathers versus 28% in the control, and 18% had criminal birth mothers versus only 7% in the control. Based on these quite dramatic figures, a very strong link between inherited characteristics and criminal behavior was proposed.
Mednick and his colleagues then replicated these kinds of results in a wider Danish study.
Yes, they did. They confirmed a similar correlation between the criminality of birth parents and their adopted away children, although the correlation was slightly less strong than in the initial Hutchings and Mednick study. But again, the most significant findings, the highest rates of criminality in adoptees, were seen when both the birth parents and the adoptive parents had criminal records.
So their overall conclusion was?
Their conclusion was that some kind of inherited characteristic, passed down from criminal biological parents, increased the likelihood of their children becoming involved in crime later in life.
But there's a really important caveat, a limitation the source adds about these adoption studies, isn't there?
Yes, a crucial one. While adoption studies are methodologically stronger than family or twin studies for separating these influences, there's a potential confound. Adoption agencies often try, consciously or unconsciously, to place children in adoptive homes that are in similar environments, similar social class, similar neighborhood type to where they came from biologically.
So the environments aren't completely separated after all.
Not necessarily. This means that the upbringing, influenced by a similar social milieu, could still be a significant factor influencing the child's behavior, making that complete separation of nature and nurture still quite challenging, even with adoption designs.
So it muddies the waters again.
It does. The source notes that Hutchings and Mednick themselves, in the end, suggested a more interactionist view, that some people might be genetically endowed in a way that makes them more likely to succumb to crime when faced with specific environmental challenges or stresses. But crucially, the chapter points out they don't really clearly define what these inherited crime-inducing characteristics actually are. It remains quite vague.
Okay. So moving beyond these broad family, twin, or adoption patterns trying to link heredity generally, researchers also drilled down into more specific biological factors they thought might be involved.
Right. This takes us into exploring things like intelligence, looking more closely at chromosomal makeup, and even examining physical body types again, but in a more modern context than Lombroso.
The idea that intelligence is linked to crime seems to be a recurring theme, sometimes quite problematic.
It definitely made a comeback in the later 20th century after falling out of favor following those early, crude, feeble-mindedness arguments. In the late 1960s, a really controversial position emerged, suggesting intelligence is primarily genetically based, and that differences in IQ could explain different criminal propensities, particularly between different ethnic groups.
Figures like Shockley and Jensen were associated with that?
Yes, they were notable proponents of that view. Later, Robert Gordon argued quite strongly that IQ is actually the best predictor of offending, even better than common social variables like class or family background.
And Hershey and Hindelang's review of existing studies also seemed to support the idea that IQ was a strong predictor.
They did. Their influential review concluded that IQ was at least as good a predictor of delinquency as major social factors. But here's the critical point the source immediately makes. IQ scores are also strongly correlated with social class and ethnic group membership. So, because offending statistics often show higher rates among lower-class young people from certain ethnic minorities, claiming that low IQ predicts crime carries the unavoidable and deeply problematic implication that these groups must have lower average IQs.
And this link, unsurprisingly, has drawn significant and pretty understandable criticism.
Absolutely. Critics like Menard and Morse argue that low IQ is just one of many disadvantages faced by some juveniles, and the real explanation for their disproportionate involvement in the justice system lies more in how society and its institutions respond to these disadvantages, things like school tracking, labeling, differential policing.
Plus, there are the criticisms of IQ tests themselves.
Exactly. Many critics point to the inherent biases in standard IQ tests, arguing they are often weighted towards middle-class and white cultural knowledge and language skills, and don't necessarily measure innate underlying intelligence fairly across different groups.
Okay, shifting gears a bit now to genetics again, but looking not just at inheritance patterns, but at the actual structure of chromosomes.
This category explores the idea that abnormalities in a person's genetic structure, specifically abnormalities in their sex chromosomes, the X and Y chromosomes, could be linked to criminality. As you know, the normal complement is XX for females, XY for males, but sometimes men are born with an extra chromosome.
Like the XXY configuration, which is known as Klinefelter syndrome.
Yes. Court Brown's studies, often conducted in psychiatric institutions, found what he reported as an unusually high incidence of criminality among males with Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. He also controversially suggested they were overrepresented among homosexuals, transvestites, and transsexuals, though the source importantly flags that these activities themselves are no longer illegal, which changes the context and relevance of those particular findings dramatically.
Right. And then there's the more widely known XYY complement, sometimes dubbed the supermale syndrome.
This is where the hypothesis of extra maleness leading to heightened aggression really came from. Early studies by researchers like Casey and Nielsen, often carried out in secure hospitals or institutions for the criminally insane, examined men with this extra Y chromosome.
What did they typically find?
They found these individuals were often very tall, tended to have lower intelligence scores on average, and frequently showed abnormal EEG readings, brainwave patterns, and crucially, many had histories of criminal and aggressive behavior, with things like theft and violent assault being identified as characteristic offenses in these early studies.
Price and Whatmore added more detail to this emerging picture of the XYY individual.
They did. They found that XYY subjects in their studies were typically convicted earlier in life than other offenders, often lacked family history of crime, suggesting it wasn't learned, were described by institutional staff as unstable and immature, showed a lack of remorse for their actions, and sometimes committed property crimes that seemed motiveless or impulsive.
However, Witkin, Mednick, and Schulsinger offered a different, less deterministic perspective on why these XYY individuals might be overrepresented in institutions.
Yes, they suggested it might not be that the extra Y chromosome directly causes criminal behavior or aggression. Instead, they proposed it might simply be due to the associated slight mental retardation or learning difficulties. This could make them more likely to get caught when they do offend, less able to navigate the legal system, and perhaps more likely to be institutionalized rather than dealt with in the community.
So more about detection and processing than inherent criminality.
That was their argument. And the source then lists a whole series of significant criticisms that have been leveled against these chromosomal abnormality theories over the years.
Okay, let's hear them.
Firstly, much of the early research was heavily concentrated on inmates in special hospitals or psychiatric institutions. This means the findings might reveal more about the characteristics of people with severe psychiatric disorders who also offend, rather than about criminality in the general population.
Sample bias, essentially.
Exactly. Secondly, there doesn't seem to be a consistent, clearly identifiable XYY syndrome with predictable behavioral outcomes. The characteristics vary widely, making it unreliable for predicting who will offend. Thirdly, for some XXY males, Klinefelters, their offending might stem from psychological issues, like anxiety about their masculinity during adolescence, rather than the extra chromosome directly causing it.
Interesting. What else?
Fourthly, and this is quite telling, the source notes that all the young XYY offenders identified in some key studies came from working-class backgrounds. This raises the possibility that their tall, well-built physique, often associated with XYY, combined with social disadvantage, might lead to them being perceived by authorities as dangerous or threatening, and thus more likely to be arrested, charged, and incarcerated by the system, a social reaction, not a direct biological cause.
And perhaps the most damning criticism of all.
The fact that we now know there are thousands of perfectly normal, law-abiding, harmless people living in the general population who happen to have either an extra X or an extra Y chromosome, they go about their lives without ever engaging in criminal behavior. This fundamentally challenges the idea of a direct, deterministic causal link between the chromosomal abnormality and crime.
It really does. Yet, the source mentions that despite this history and these criticisms, there's been a sort of recent revival in genetic science looking at behavior.
Yes, figures like Ellis in the 1990s have looked towards evolutionary theories, natural selection, and genetic evolution to propose explanations for certain criminal activities, things like rape, assault, child abuse, property offenses. He linked them to what he called powerful genetic forces.
But does he offer proof?
No. The source is careful to note that Ellis offers no actual proof for these claims, just a hypothesis based on assumptions about human behavior mirroring animal behavior patterns driven by reproductive strategies. It's speculative.
And while geneticists are definitely identifying specific genes linked to tendencies or susceptibilities to certain diseases, they seem generally quite cautious about claiming that heredity primarily determines complex human behaviors like crime.
That's the key distinction the source draws. The discovery that some personality traits, like impulsivity or sensation-seeking, might have a genetic component, does strengthen the possibility that some criminal behavior might be influenced by a genetic susceptibility that is then triggered or expressed only under certain environmental conditions or stresses. It's a more nuanced, interactionist view.
And the source notes this interactionist perspective will be revisited later in the book.
Yes, in chapter 13, apparently.
Okay, another area of biological focus, one with roots going directly back to the Lombrosian tradition, is concentrating on criminal body types or physique.
Right. This is the idea that a person's physical build, their somatotype, is somehow linked to their personality, temperament, and therefore their propensity for crime. Kretschmer, back in the early 20th century, identified body types like asthenics, lean and narrow, athletics, muscular, broad-chested, pitniks, medium-build, rotund, and mixed types.
And he linked these builds to psychological dispositions.
Yes, he argued, for example, that the asthenic and athletic types were more linked to schizophrenic tendencies, while pitniks were more linked to manic-depressive tendencies, linking body and mind.
Then Hooton took this much further and much more controversially with his extensive measurements.
He did. In 1939, Hooton conducted incredibly detailed physical measurements on over 17,000 individuals, both criminals and non-criminals. His conclusion was stark and highly controversial. Criminals, he claimed, were organically inferior to non-criminals. He even pointed to features like low foreheads as indicators of this supposed inferiority.
And his work had explicitly racist elements too, didn't it?
Alarmingly so. The source states his study contained openly racist claims, suggesting, for instance, that environmental factors determined delinquency more among Negro and Negroid populations than among whites, implying a different biological basis. As the source notes, his work was widely condemned, not just for its racist overtones, but also for major methodological flaws.
Such as?
Failing to recognize that his criminal sample only included those who had been caught and convicted, a biased sample that might not represent all offenders. And his control group of non-criminals was also found to be unrepresentative of the general population. Just bad science, really.
Sheldon's 1949 work is presented as the first modern, more systematic attempt to link physique and offending.
Yes. Sheldon shifted the focus specifically to offending male youths, typically aged 15-21. He studied their physique, but also their temperament, intelligence, and offending history. He classified physiques based on 3 components, rating each individual on a scale for each.
What were the components?
Endomorphy, softness, fatness; mesomorphy, muscularity, athletic build; and ectomorphy, skinniness, fragility.
And his conclusion?
His main conclusion was that most of the delinquent youths in his sample tended towards mesomorphy, the muscular, athletic build. He also went on to claim that the factors producing criminal behavior were fundamentally inherited, often pointing to the fact that many of the youths came from parents who were also offenders, though that doesn't prove inheritance.
The Glucks, Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck, conducted a famous comparative study in 1950 that seemed to support Sheldon's findings on body type, didn't it?
It did. Their study, comparing delinquent boys with non-delinquent boys from similar backgrounds, found that the delinquent group did tend to have physical characteristics like narrower faces, wider chests, larger and broader waists, and bigger forearms. They calculated that around 60% of the delinquents were predominantly mesomorphic, compared to a much smaller percentage of the non-delinquents.
But again, the big question is causality, right? Does the body type cause the crime?
Exactly. That's the crucial weakness the source points out for all these body type theories. Like their predecessors, neither Sheldon nor the Gloops could definitively establish causality. Was it their physical build itself, or maybe the temperament associated with it, that directly caused them to offend? Or was it more about social conception that boys with that build were perceived differently, maybe expected to be tougher, channeled into certain activities, or reacted to more harshly by the system,
Or could third factors be at play?
like poverty and deprivation? These could influence both body build, through diet, nutrition, physical labor, and the likelihood of offending through lack of opportunity, stress, etc. The correlation doesn't prove causation.
So criticisms of these body type theories often focus on that failure to account for the interaction between physical characteristics and social circumstances.
Precisely. People from poorer backgrounds might have different diets leading to smaller stature, or engage in more manual occupations leading to a more athletic build. The overrepresentation of mesomorphs among convicted criminals could easily be explained by sociocultural factors.
Like what?
Maybe certain types of crime, like robbery or assault, simply require or attract individuals with more physical strength or an imposing presence. Or perhaps people with this build are just more likely to be perceived as threatening by victims, witnesses, or police, and therefore more likely to be arrested and processed through the system. It could be selection bias.
There's a debate mentioned in the source between this idea of social selection versus a direct biological cause.
Yes. Gibbons argued that the high rate of mesomorphy found among offenders is primarily due to social selection. The activities involved in certain types of crime, like gang fights or physical intimidation, naturally draw in individuals who are more athletic or muscular.
But Cortez and Gotti countered that view.
They did. They argued that Gibbons wrongly dismissed biological factors entirely. They suggested that physical factors are actually essential to the social selection process. You need the build to succeed in certain criminal roles. They argued for an interactionist view, saying human behavior is a product of both biological and social causes working together.
What about later findings on body type? Did they clear things up?
Not really. The ambiguity seems to remain. Hartle and colleagues did a 30-year follow-up study of Sheldon's original subjects and found that the link between mesomorphy and criminality persisted in that group over time. However, the large and very influential Cambridge study in delinquent development, which followed a large group of London boys from childhood, found no evidence that the boys who became offenders were physically different, in terms of body build, from those who didn't, when measured as children.
So conflicting evidence again.
Pretty much. The source also mentions a controversial finding by Rain and colleagues in 2000, suggesting that 3-year-old children who were just half an inch taller than their peers had a greater chance of being identified as classroom bullies. This led to a rather ambitious and much debated suggestion of a potential developmental pathway linking early physical size to later violent criminality. Highly speculative.
Okay, let's shift our focus now from these overall physique or inherited trait ideas to the brain and the nervous system itself. Looking inside the head, so to speak.
Right. This area of biological positivism explores how neurological conditions, brain injuries, or differences in brain function might be linked to criminal behavior.
The source seems pretty cautious about making direct links between general brain injuries and crime, though.
It does. It notes that overall there's actually little evidence that random brain injuries directly cause criminal behavior in most cases. Such instances are considered rare. The person's original personality and their social background are usually much more significant factors in determining their behavior after an injury.
But specific injuries could matter.
Yes, the caveat is that an injury in a specific area of the brain, particularly one involved in regulating emotion or aggression, might potentially accentuate an underlying tendency towards aggression that was already there. It could lower impulse control, for example.
What about minimal brain dysfunction, or MBD? That's mentioned as a possible link.
MBD is described as a condition sometimes linked to learning disabilities. The argument is that these learning difficulties could then indirectly lead to offending through various routes: school failure, frustration associating with delinquent peers, etc. But the source notes there's actually little clear evidence of a specific identifiable neurological malfunction causing MBD itself. The associated personality changes described are things like forgetfulness, impaired concentration, and reduced spontaneity.
Okay. What about more serious conditions, organic psychoses, that are clearly linked to identifiable brain lesions or malfunctions? Does the source give examples?
Yes, it lists several examples where damage or dysfunction of the brain is linked to specific behavioral issues that can, in some cases, manifest as criminal acts. Like epidemic encephalitis, which was apparently widespread among children in the 1920s, was linked to subsequent behaviors like destructiveness, impulsiveness, arson, and abnormal sexual behavior in some affected individuals. Senile dementia in the elderly can involve general cognitive deterioration, but may also include behaviors like arson, paranoid delusions leading to aggression, or deviant sexual behavior.
Any others?
Huntington's chorea, which is an inherited disease causing progressive brain decay, can lead to involuntary movements, apathy, depression, but also potentially vicious assaults in some stages. Brain tumors, particularly those located in the temporal lobe, which is heavily involved in emotion, can apparently activate aggressive neural systems, leading to sudden, uncharacteristic violent outbursts, sometimes including murder.
And importantly, that can sometimes be reversible.
Yes. The source notes that if the tumor is surgically removed, the aggressive behavior often disappears, which strongly suggests a direct causal link in those specific cases. Temporal lobe epilepsy is also mentioned, with some, though not all, sufferers occasionally making violent assaults during seizures, ictal violence, or sometimes even between seizures, interictal violence.
There also seems to be a particular focus on the limbic system in relation to violence.
Yes, the limbic system is a complex network of structures deep within the brain, including things like the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, that's absolutely critical for mediating emotions and basic drives, like hunger, pleasure, fear, sex, and anger. Research suggests that malfunctions or abnormalities in this system do appear to be related to violent and aggressive behavior.
How has that been studied?
Well, electrical stimulation experiments in specific limbic areas can induce aggression, or conversely docility, in animals and sometimes in humans undergoing brain surgery. And in some extreme historical cases, surgical removal or lesioning, intentionally damaging parts of the limbic system, like the amygdala, has been used in attempts to control severe uncontrollable aggression in humans, though this is highly controversial and rarely done now.
Brainwave patterns measured by EEG are also discussed quite a bit in relation to crime and psychopathy.
Right. Electroencephalograms, or EEGs, record the electrical activity of the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp. Studies cited in the chapter, like those by Stafford Clark and Taylor, found that abnormal EEG patterns were most common among criminals diagnosed as aggressive psychopaths, and least common among emotionally stable individuals.
High incidence in certain groups.
Yes. They also noted a high incidence of these abnormalities among murderers who were described by psychiatrists as abnormal or clearly insane. It's also mentioned that EEG abnormalities are often associated with other conditions we've discussed, like chromosomal abnormalities, extra X or Y, and are always present in individuals with epilepsy. They're also found frequently, though not universally, in individuals diagnosed with psychopathy.
The source provides 3 possible explanations for why there might be this observed link between EEG abnormality and psychopathy. What are they?
One idea is that psychopaths might have fundamentally different levels of sensory perception or arousal compared to others, which is reflected in their brainwaves. Another possibility is that there's a specific malfunction in brain mechanisms responsible for processing and regulating emotion.
And the third one involves development.
Yes. The third is the concept of a developmental lag, or immaturity. The idea is that the adult brain of some psychopaths retains certain brainwave patterns that are more typical of childhood. This is then linked to the emotional immaturity and impulsive behavior often seen in psychopathy and early adult behavior disorders. And interestingly, this abnormal EEG pattern and the associated behavior problems often tends to reduce or normalize as the individual gets older.
But again, like with other biological factors, there are significant problems and criticisms of these EEG studies trying to explain crime, aren't there?
Big problems. The source points out, firstly, that many individuals diagnosed as psychopathic have perfectly normal EEG patterns. And conversely, many non-criminals, people functioning normally in society, can exhibit bizarre or abnormal EEG patterns without any associated behavioral problems.
So it's not a reliable marker.
Not at all. Furthermore, interpreting EEG readings is complex, and experts often disagree on their meaning or significance. And crucially, drugs that are known to stabilize brain rhythms, like anticonvulsants used to treat epilepsy, seem to have no effect on the characteristic behavior patterns of psychopaths.
So the conclusion is,
because of all these inconsistencies and interpretive difficulties, the source concludes pretty firmly that it is not possible to produce a general explanation of crime based solely on studies of the brain and central nervous system, including EEG findings. It mentions Eysenk's theory, which does involve the autonomic nervous system, but notes that it's primarily a psychological theory, bridging towards the next chapter's focus.
childhood behavior disorders are also mentioned in this section, potentially stemming from brain dysfunction early in life.
Yes, the idea is that some disorders might be caused by subtle brain dysfunction resulting from complications during pregnancy, birth, or early childhood illnesses or injuries. Attention deficit disorder, ADD, often with hyperactivity, ADHD, is given as an example of a condition sometimes thought to involve mild brain dysfunction.
And the link to crime.
Symptoms include behavioral problems and poor cognitive responses, which can lead to difficulties at school and socially. A study by Muniza and colleagues followed a sample of hyperactive children into adulthood. They found that significantly more of the hyperactive group were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned compared to a non-hyperactive control group. But and this is a but they also found that this difference was almost entirely explained by whether the individual developed a severe antisocial conduct disorder in young adulthood, rather than the hyperactivity itself being the direct cause of the adult offending.
So hyperactivity alone wasn't the key driver.
It seemed that hyperactivity combined with conduct disorder was the high-risk combination. The Cambridge study in delinquent development also found a link between ADHD symptoms and behavioral problems in childhood and higher rates of offending later on.
Did they attribute it to biology?
Interestingly, no, not necessarily. In that study, the ADHD problems were associated with factors like low IQ, starting to offend at an early age, coming from a large family, and having criminal parents. The separate behavioral problems, like aggression, defiance, were more strongly linked to deficient parenting practices. Because of these overlapping factors, the Cambridge study researchers felt that the connection between ADHD and crime was not necessarily biological, arguing that environmental and social factors could be highly influential or even primary.
Learning disabilities, also sometimes allegedly stemming from central nervous system dysfunction, are another area mentioned as being linked to offending.
Yes, and here again, the source highlights the difficulty in separating a potential biological cause from the social consequences and reactions. It paints a plausible picture of how children with learning difficulties might struggle in school.
Get labeled.
Exactly. Get perceived negatively by teachers and peers, seen as disruptive, lazy, or unintelligent. This can lead to frustration, low self-esteem, peer rejection, social isolation, truancy, maybe school exclusion.
And then they end up mixing with other disaffected young people.
Potentially, yes. Finding acceptance on the streets, possibly getting drawn into deviant subcultures where offending is more common. So the paths from a learning disability to crime might be heavily mediated by social experiences. However, the source adds an important counterpoint here.
Which is?
It suggests that ignoring conditions that do have a genuine biological or neurological foundation in children can be very disadvantageous to them. It uses the relatively recent widespread recognition of autistic spectrum disorders, ASDs, as an example. Understanding the biological basis has been crucial for developing appropriate support and interventions, even if it doesn't directly explain crime.
That leads us very smoothly into discussing autistic spectrum disorders specifically. The source presents this as a contemporary example of a biologically founded condition where there has been some attention regarding potential links to behavior and, occasionally, crime.
Right. Historically, the term autism was used in different ways. Bleuler initially used it to describe a symptom of withdrawal seen in schizophrenia. Later, Leo Kanner distinguished childhood autism as a condition where individuals seem to have never developed social relationships in the first place, unlike those with schizophrenia who might withdraw from previously formed relationships.
And Hans Asperger described something similar but different.
Yes, around the same time, Hans Asperger described what he called autistic psychopathy in more intellectually able individuals, focusing on their peculiarities in communication and their difficulties with social adaptation and interaction. Kanner's work became widely recognized much earlier, especially in the U.S., but Asperger's work was somewhat overlooked until Lorna Wing brought it to prominence in the English-speaking world much later in the 1980s.
And Wing, along with Judith Gould, made a crucial contribution by identifying the core features shared by individuals described by both Kanner and Asperger, didn't they?
Yes, that was a key insight. They found that children across this range, from those with classic Kanner's autism and intellectual disability to those with Asperger's syndrome and average or high intelligence, shared a fundamental triad of impairments.
The triad being?
Difficulties in social interaction, understanding social cues, forming relationships, difficulties in communication, both verbal and nonverbal, and difficulties with imagination, leading to restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. This shared triad led to the concept of autism as a spectrum of disorders, ASDs ranging from clear-cut severe autism to much more subtle traits that can even be found in the general population.
The source mentions autistic traits are widely distributed.
Yes. Citing Thambirja, it notes that autistic traits are now understood to be widely distributed throughout the normal population to varying degrees.
And these conditions, ASDs, are classified as pervasive developmental disorders with a biological basis.
Correct. They are considered neurodevelopmental disorders, meaning they have a neurological basis in the brain. Genetic causes are thought to play a major role, although the precise biological mechanisms are still not fully understood and likely complex. Importantly, ASDs are currently defined based on behavioral criteria, observing the triad of impairments because there aren't yet any known specific biological markers, like a blood test or brain scan, that could definitively diagnose them.
And this variability and lack of biological markers can make diagnosis challenging.
Yes, especially in milder cases or where other conditions coexist.
So how does this biological condition connect to the discussion of crime risk factors?
The connection arises, according to the source, when you look at factors known to increase the risk of someone becoming involved in criminal behavior later in life. Things like experiencing peer rejection, having low popularity, being socially isolated, having poor social functioning skills, maybe being impulsive. These are all statistically associated with an increased risk of future offending.
And these are also experiences or traits common among children and young people on the autistic spectrum.
Yes, due to the core difficulties associated with the condition, individuals with ASD are statistically more likely to experience these kinds of social challenges. This leads to the observation, cited from Holland, that because people on the spectrum have difficulties that significantly impair their understanding of the social world, they may be more prone as a group to engaging in probable behavior and potentially offending compared to neurotypical individuals.
The source details some specific features of ASD that could theoretically predispose someone to behavior that might be seen as criminal.
It does. One feature mentioned is having very narrow, intense obsessions or special interests, combined with an unawareness or difficulty understanding how pursuing this interest might affect others. The source gives a poignant example from Howlin, a young man with autism who was fascinated by washing machines and would enter strangers' houses simply to look at them, genuinely not appreciating the alarm or distress his actions would cause.
Lack of social understanding.
Exactly. Another is difficulty interpreting rules, especially unwritten or complex social rules. This can lead to individuals finding themselves, as the source puts it, unwittingly embroiled in offenses. An example given is navigating the complex social cues in a dating context, where misinterpretations could potentially lead to situations perceived as inappropriate or even resulting in an offense like date rape without malicious intent.
Social naivety seems key here.
Yes, linked to that is social naivety and sometimes an eagerness to be accepted, which can make individuals with ASD easy prey for manipulation by others, potentially becoming unwitting accomplices to criminals because they don't fully understand the motives or intentions of those they're associating with.
What else?
Another point mentioned is that people with autism often have a strong preference for routine and predictability and can find unexpected changes very distressing. This distress can sometimes manifest as an aggressive outburst when routines are disrupted or they feel overwhelmed.
Asperger himself apparently suggested a possible association between his autistic psychopathy and violence.
Yes, the source notes Asperger suggested this possibility, and other studies since have documented specific case examples of violence involving individuals with ASD. However, and this is where the crucial point from the source comes in, citing Howland again.
Yes.
Howland's observation is highly pertinent. She states that despite occasional and sometimes sensationalized media publicity suggesting a significant amount of violent crime among more able individuals with autism or Asperger's, there is actually little empirical evidence of any significant statistical association between autism as a condition and overall criminal offending rates in the population.
So the link isn't supported by the broader data.
Not in terms of autism causing higher rates of crime overall. The source does mention specific tragic case examples like a 13-year-old autistic boy who killed his baby brother, reportedly stating his motivation was, "I wanted to be with my mom," or a 21-year-old male with ASD who killed his boss, apparently believing he had acted appropriately according to his own rigid logic.
These individual cases are incredibly disturbing, but the source cautions against drawing general conclusions.
Exactly. It's careful to acknowledge that other factors are almost certainly at play in such extreme cases. Things like poor parental supervision, a chaotic or abusive home environment, a family history of poor mental health or criminality. These could all significantly predispose any vulnerable person with or without ASD to violence.
So the complex takeaway here is that while certain symptoms or traits associated with ASD can potentially increase the risk of problem behavior or offending in specific individuals or contexts.
It is absolutely vital, as the source stresses, to understand that most people on the autistic spectrum do not become involved in criminal behavior. Society needs to be aware of the condition and the difficulties individuals face to provide appropriate support and understanding, but the source underscores that the vast majority are law-abiding citizens.
It even points out that many successful people are thought to be on the spectrum.
Yes, it mentions that many famous people, both historically and today, are believed to have been on the spectrum, and their artistic traits like intense focus, attention to detail, unique perspectives likely contributed significantly to their success in various fields. It underlines that ASD is not synonymous with criminality.
Which really reinforces that core theme we've seen running throughout this chapter, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The critical point isn't just the biological factor, whether it's genes, brain structure, or a condition like ASD in isolation. It's almost always about the specific interaction between a potential biological predisposition or trait and the particular social context, environment, and experiences an individual encounters throughout their life.
Okay, let's move now into the realm of biochemical theories. This section looks at the body's internal chemistry, hormones, blood sugar, things like that, and how imbalances might influence behavior.
Right. These theories focus on substances and chemical processes that are naturally present or produced within the body, which distinguishes them slightly from the altered biological state theories we'll get to next, which involve introducing outside chemical agents like drugs or alcohol.
So what categories fall under these biochemical theories?
The source discusses three main areas here: sexual hormones, blood sugar levels, and adrenaline sensitivity.
Starting with sexual hormones, this often brings up testosterone and aggression.
It does. Various glands in the body, the pituitary, adrenals, gonads, testes, ovaries, pancreas, thyroid, produce hormones that regulate numerous bodily functions and behavior, and they have extensive feedback loops with the central nervous system. Early on, figures like Schlapp and Smith suggested quite broadly that either excessive production or underproduction of certain hormones could lead to emotional disturbance, which in turn could contribute to criminal behavior.
And the link between the male sex hormone testosterone and aggression is well established in animal behavior studies.
Yes, male animals across many species are generally more aggressive than females, and this is strongly linked to testosterone levels. This naturally led researchers to explore the link between testosterone and aggressive crimes like murder and rape in humans.
But the human link is more complex.
Much more complex, it seems. Studies have shown that in most men, normal variations in testosterone levels within the typical range do not significantly affect their overall aggression levels. While some studies conducted specifically on violent male prisoners did show some correlation between higher testosterone and aggression, the effect generally wasn't as strong or consistent as the findings from animal studies might have led researchers to expect.
Later studies tried to be more precise, differentiating types of aggression, perhaps.
Exactly. Owens, for example, studied young men without criminal records and found what he described as a clear link between testosterone levels and both verbal and physical aggression, like getting into fights or arguments. He also tried to differentiate between provoked aggression, a defensive response to a perceived threat or unfairness, and unprovoked aggression, seemingly spontaneous violence or destructiveness. The link to unprovoked violence appeared to be more indirect, possibly mediated by factors like general irritability.
Schalling's work added another layer.
Yes. Schalling's research suggested that high testosterone levels in young males were more strongly linked to verbal aggression, things like using threats to protect their social status, rather than necessarily leading directly to physical aggression. Boys with lower testosterone levels, she found, seemed less likely to verbally defend their position in social hierarchies.
So, bottom line, neither of these studies suggests a straightforward, direct cause and effect link between testosterone levels and actually committing crimes.
Correct. While it's plausible that individuals with naturally higher testosterone might be more likely to react aggressively or resort to violence in a provocative situation, these studies don't provide evidence of a direct causal link to criminal behavior in general.
Ellis and Krantz pointed out a correlation, though.
They pointed out that the peak ages for testosterone production puberty and the early 20s correlate quite well with the peak ages for crime rates,
Yeah.
particularly for violent and property crimes. They argued this was persuasive evidence for a biological explanation that could account for crime patterns across societies where sociological explanations sometimes struggled.
But correlation isn't causation.
Precisely. The source explicitly states there is no evidence of a causal relationship here. The link might be much more tenuous. Perhaps testosterone merely provides a kind of biological environment, for
Right.
example, increased drive, energy, risk-taking propensity, where other social or environmental factors could then more easily lead to aggression or crime. It's not deterministic.
The source also mentions cortisol, the stress hormone.
Yes, briefly. A study by McBurnett and colleagues found that low levels of the stress hormone cortisol, measured in saliva, were linked to displaying violent behavior in male children. Those with lower cortisol were reportedly 3 times more likely to exhibit such behavior. This suggests the stress response system might also play a role.
Okay, what about the link between blood sugar levels and behavior? Hypoglycemia.
Hypoglycemia, which is abnormally low blood sugar, often associated with diabetes but can occur for other reasons, has been linked in some research to symptoms like irritability, confusion, and potentially aggressive reactions. In some rare and extreme cases, it's been suggested as a potential contributing factor in seemingly inexplicable acts like sexual offenses, assaults, or even motiveless murder, possibly due to impaired judgment and impulse control.
Are there studies supporting this?
The source mentions a few lines of evidence. Schwenthaler conducted experiments purportedly showing that lowering the daily intake of sucrose, refined sugar, in juvenile detention centers was associated with a reduction in reported antisocial behavior among the inmates. Smart studied the broader effects of undernutrition on the central nervous system and aggression.
And Verkunen found links between hyperglycemia and other antisocial activities.
Yes, Verkunen's research linked hypoglycemia not just to aggression but also to a cluster of other issues like truancy, low verbal IQ, getting tattoos, stealing from home, and alcohol abuse. He also noted that alcohol consumption itself can induce hypoglycemia, a blood sugar crash after initial effects wear off, which might be one mechanism by which alcohol increases aggression.
The source provides a very specific and quite dramatic case example related to hypoglycemia, the Clapham case.
Yes, it's a striking example of how this factor played out in court. A man who stabbed his wife and then attempted suicide was ultimately acquitted of murder. The defense argued he had been on a very strict weight loss diet, severely restricting sugar and other carbohydrates. He then consumed a quantity of whiskey on an empty stomach, which apparently led to a state of amnesia.
And the medical evidence.
Blood tests taken weeks later showed he suffered from reactive hypoglycemia, a condition where blood sugar drops significantly after eating or drinking, especially sugary things or alcohol. The jury accepted the expert medical opinion presented that, at the time of the offense, his metabolic state was such that he was essentially reduced to an automaton acting without conscious control or intent. A very rare defense, but it highlights the potential behavioral impact.
Fascinating. Okay, the third biochemical area discussed is adrenaline sensitivity and arousal levels.
Right, this area's study looks at the relationship between the body's stress response system involving hormones like adrenaline, epinephrine, and noradrenaline, norepinephrine, and aggressive or antisocial behavior. It's somewhat related to the testosterone research, looking at hormone levels and behavior.
What did the early research find? Schachter's experiments.
Schachter conducted experiments back in the 1960s involving adrenaline injections. He reported that these injections produced a significant physiological and emotional reaction in individuals diagnosed as psychopaths, but had no notable differential effect on normal prisoners. This suggested psychopaths might process or react to stress hormones differently.
Hare's research pointed in a similar direction.
Yes, Robert Hare's extensive research on psychopathy often found that individuals scoring high on psychopathy measures exhibit fewer physiological signs of stress or anxiety, like changes in heart rate or sweating, when faced with threatening or stressful situations, compared to non-psychopaths. They seem less physiologically reactive to threat.
Mednick and colleagues also found differences in arousal.
They did. Their research suggested that violent criminals, as a group, seem to need stronger stimuli to become physiologically aroused and perhaps recovered more slowly from stressful experiences compared to non-offenders. Lower baseline arousal, perhaps.
And Hans Eysenk's personality theory offered an explanation for this low arousal link to crime.
Yes, Eysenk's theory, which we'll likely cover more later, suggested that individuals with naturally low innate levels of critical arousal, leading to low stress levels and less sensitivity, are easily bored. Consequently, they become sensation seekers, craving exciting, stimulating, and often risky experiences to bring their arousal up to an optimal level.
So situations most people find stressful are actually enjoyable for them.
Exactly. Normal, stressful, or dangerous situations might provide the thrill they're looking for, something to be sought after rather than avoided. Baldwin later connected this idea to the observed age crime curve.
How so?
He proposed that crime rates are highest in adolescence and early adulthood, partly because baseline arousal levels might naturally decline with age, reducing the need for such intense external stimulation. He suggested the buzz or stimulation derived from criminal activity might diminish as individuals get older, along with the physical fitness and strength often required, helping to explain both why young people might get into crime, seeking stimulation, and why many desist as they mature.
But this raises a fundamental question, doesn't it?
It does. Isn't it individuals' adrenaline production, sensitivity, and overall arousal level primarily determined by their biology, their genes? Or is it significantly shaped by their social environment, experiences, upbringing, and learning? Or, most likely, some complex interaction of both? The source leaves that question hanging.
Okay, moving now from internal biochemistry to altered biological state theories. This is where we look at changes caused by introducing external chemical agents into the body.
Exactly. This category looks at how substances people consume, things not naturally produced by the body, can affect physiology and behavior, potentially leading to crime. The source discusses three main areas here: allergies and diet, alcohol, and illegal drugs.
Starting with allergies and diet, this seems a bit different from hormones or neurotransmitters.
It is, but the underlying idea is similar. Something ingested affects the body's chemistry, which in turn affects behavior. Links have been proposed between irritability, aggression, and even criminal assault, and allergic reactions to various substances, common allergens like pollen or dust mites, but also certain drugs or specific foods and food additives.
Is there evidence for this?
The source mentions studies on patients experiencing allergic reactions, sometimes noted associated behavioral changes. These included things like emotional immaturity, manifesting as temper tantrums, excessive whining or crying in children, and antisocial behavior, such as becoming withdrawn, sulky, or even exhibiting cruelty.
More recent research tries to integrate these ideas.
Yes, some more recent research, often falling under headings like orthomolecular medicine or nutritional criminology, tries to integrate ideas about blood sugar levels, allergies, vitamin deficiencies, and other biochemical imbalances. Concepts like biochemical individuality suggest each person has unique internal chemistry and therefore varying nutritional needs. Orthomolecular medicine proposes preventing or treating diseases, including potentially behavioral ones, by diagnosing and correcting these biochemical imbalances through targeted vitamins, minerals, dietary changes, and avoiding harmful substances.
Prince and colleagues specifically suggested a link between certain foods or additives and hyperactivity or criminality.
Yes, that line of research explored links between diet, particularly things like sugar or food colorings, and behavioral problems in children. The source also briefly mentions that low cholesterol levels have been linked in some studies with hypoglycemia, especially when combined with alcohol use, potentially creating a biochemical risk factor.
So what's the overall conclusion on diet and biochemistry?
The source concludes that the evidence suggesting an active role for biochemical disturbances, whether from diet, allergies, or internal imbalances, in contributing to some violent offenses is simply too significant to be ignored entirely. It notes the reported success of orthomolecular treatments for some mental disorders, like using high-dose vitamin B3 for schizophrenia, and suggests that addiction itself might, in some cases, be related to unmet biochemical individual needs that substances temporarily satisfy.
And this concept of substance abuse naturally leads into alcohol and drugs. The source notes it includes legal substances, too.
Yes, it makes the point that substance abuse includes legal substances like alcohol, but also things like glues, solvents, lighter fluids, as well as prescribed medications like barbiturates or tranquilizers if misused, alongside illegal drugs.
And of all these, alcohol probably has the strongest and broadest links with crime.
That's what the source argues. Probably much closer links with crime overall than most other drugs, perhaps with the contemporary exception of substances like crack cocaine or maybe heroin, which have very strong links to acquisitive crime.
Why is the alcohol link considered so strong?
Primarily because of its legality, widespread availability, and extremely common usage across almost all segments of society. Because it's so prevalent, it has a long, well-documented association with antisocial activity and crime.
The chapter provides a lot of statistical evidence pointing to this link, particularly from the US and UK.
It does, citing various studies. Saunders estimated back in the early 90s that alcohol was a significant factor in about 1,000 arrests every single day in the USA. Flanzer estimated that alcohol was involved in as many as 80% of family violence cases in the US at one point. DeLuca found that almost a third of reported violence against children was alcohol-related.
And links to general violence.
Studies by Collins and Fagan highlighted a strong statistical link between alcohol consumption and general violence. Collins also showed that considerable numbers of nonviolent offenders reported having been drinking around the time they committed their offense. Rada's study of convicted rapists found half had been drinking before the offense. Collins also concluded that prisoners who had severe drinking problems committed significantly more assaults while incarcerated than other prisoners. Lindqvist's Swedish study found 2/3 of convicted murderers had been drinking prior to the crime. The numbers are stark.
But even with all this compelling correlational data, the source again cautions against assuming a simple, direct causal link where alcohol makes people commit crimes.
That's a vital point. The relationship is complex. Firstly, alcohol clearly doesn't affect everyone the same way. There can be differences in metabolism. The source mentions Native Americans and Eskimos metabolize it more slowly than white people, for example. Psychological state also matters.
And genetics can play a role in alcoholism itself.
Yes. Goodwin and colleagues suggested that a predisposition to developing alcoholism can be genetically transmitted, so the link might be indirect. Also, any psychoactive drug, including alcohol, can potentially accentuate pre-existing psychological symptoms or personality traits, like impulsivity or poor emotional regulation, in vulnerable individuals, rather than causing the behavior from scratch.
So the link isn't necessarily straightforward. Drink alcohol, commit crime. There could be other explanations.
Definitely. Ramsey is cited suggesting that the overall lifestyle and subculture often associated with heavy drinking or alcoholism, the social settings, the peer groups, the economic consequences, might be more relevant to involvement in crime than just the pharmacological effect of the alcohol itself.
And Abram proposed a third factor explanation.
Yes, Abram suggested that both heavy alcohol use and criminal behavior might be independent outcomes of a third underlying factor, such as an antisocial personality disorder, or shared environmental factors like poverty or lack of opportunity. The alcohol use and crime might just co-occur rather than one causing the other directly.
And importantly, the link isn't just about offenders drinking. It extends to victims of crime, too.
That's another key finding discussed. Research consistently shows that victims of crime, particularly violent crime, are frequently found to have been drinking themselves around the time of the incident. Gottfredson's work in the UK showed that a person's chances of becoming a victim of crime increased significantly with their level of alcohol consumption.
Especially for young people.
Yes, particularly for young people, according to Mott. Hodge found that in his sample, 2/3 of assailants and half of the victims had been drinking immediately before the offense occurred. The British Crime Survey also found that victims of domestic violence reported far higher levels of alcohol consumption than the general population. Drinking can increase vulnerability.
The source highlights a notable UK-specific trend regarding alcohol consumption among young people, suggesting a significant shift over time.
It does. It contrasts the interwar period, when young people aged 18-24 were among the lightest drinkers, with the situation from the 1960s onwards. By the 1980s, this age group had become the heaviest consumers of alcohol in the UK.
And hazardous drinking peaked in the late teens, early 20s.
Yes, by the early 2000s, studies showed hazardous drinking patterns peaking in teenagers and young adults, with significant percentages of both males, over 60% of 20-24-year-olds, and females, over 30% of 16-19-year-olds, engaging in levels of consumption considered dangerous.
And the age of starting regular drinking has dropped.
Worryingly, yes. There's been a trend towards a decline in the age at which young people start regular drinking, often around 14 or 15, with some surveys even showing children as young as 9 or 10 purporting having consumed alcohol.
And the way young people drink has changed too, hasn't it? The motivation.
Yes. The source points to a trend towards drinking specifically for the effect, aiming for intoxication, often merging alcohol consumption with the wider drug scene as part of youth culture. Binge drinking, typically defined as consuming 5 or more standard drinks on a single occasion, becomes common by age 15-16 for many, and this pattern is linked to an increased likelihood of continuing binge drinking habits into adulthood.
All of which makes alcohol-related crime a major public concern in the UK.
Hugely so. The source states that around 70% of crime audits conducted by local authorities in the UK identify alcohol as a significant contributing factor, particularly in relation to public disorder involving young males aged 18-30, often concentrated in or around city centers and entertainment areas at night.
But the link goes beyond just late-night trouble.
Oh, yes. It impacts a whole range of offenses. A Home Office report from 1990 even pointed to the growth in overall beer consumption as the single most important factor explaining the increase in recorded crimes of violence against the person at that time. We've already mentioned the high proportion of violent crime victims who were drinking, and it's noted that a minimum of 1 in 5 people arrested for any offense test positive for alcohol.
The statistics cited from various groups are pretty staggering.
They are. Figures attributed to the British Medical Association suggest alcohol is a factor in 60–70% of homicides, 75% of stabbings, 70% of beatings, and 50% of fights and domestic assaults. The Police Superintendents Association estimated it was involved in 50% of all crimes. And the National Association of Probation Officers reported that around 30% of people on probation and nearly 60% of prisoners had severe alcohol problems linked to their offending. It's pervasive.
Okay, finally, under these altered state theories, let's look at illegal drug use and its link to crime.
Right. Unlike alcohol, the source notes that illegal drug use has a much shorter history as a major focus in criminology and as a widespread social problem. It really only started being widely labeled as such and systematically regulated in the early 20th century.
But the basic mechanism is similar to alcohol, altering body chemistry.
Yes. Drugs fundamentally alter the chemical balance of the body and brain, which in turn affects behavior. However, the specific effect varies greatly depending on the type of drug and the quantity consumed. Some drugs, like cannabis, or opiates, like heroin, tend to reduce aggression or induce passivity. Others, particularly stimulants like cocaine, and especially crack cocaine, are strongly associated with increased agitation, paranoia, and violence.
The source contrasts the typical societal views on illegal drug use versus alcohol misuse.
It does, pointing out a common dichotomy. Illegal drug use is often framed as intrinsically wrong, morally deviant behavior requiring punishment and control, usually through the criminal justice system. Alcohol misuse, despite the harms we just discussed, is more often framed as a social or personal problem, perhaps a disease requiring treatment and support, often through health or social services. A different moral lens is often applied.
The source provides some usage statistics for England and Wales from the early 2000s to give context.
Yes, these show that around 10–11% of adults aged 16 to 59 reported using an illicit drug in the past year, with prevalence significantly higher among 16 to 24-year-olds, around 25% of that age group.
What were the most common drugs?
Cannabis was the most common drug overall, especially for young people. Among Class A drugs, ecstasy was the most common for young people at that time. Cocaine use was reported as increasing, particularly among young males, while amphetamine and LSD use seemed to be declining. Drug use was also found to be widespread among school pupils, although surveys indicated a slight decrease from peaks around 2003–04.
And breaking the link between drugs and other criminal behavior has been a key government strategy.
Yes, a major focus, driven partly by the enormous estimated costs associated with this link. Figures cited from the early 2000s put the cost of drug-related offenses to the criminal justice system alone at $1.2 billion per year, with the total estimated social costs of Class A drug use, including health, crime, lost productivity, reaching nearly $12 billion annually in the UK.
Research on UK offenders has particularly highlighted the link between certain types of drug use and acquisitive crime, right? Funding the habit.
Absolutely. Crimes like shoplifting, burglary, robbery, and fraud are identified as primary means by which many users, particularly those dependent on expensive drugs, fund their consumption. Users of heroin and crack cocaine are consistently found to be the most prolific offenders among the drug-using population, often committing 5 to 10 times more offenses than comparable offenders who don't use these drugs. It's estimated they're responsible for over half the total value of all acquisitive crime.
But the relationship between starting drug use and starting crime isn't always simple.
No, the source describes the link as complex. For some individuals, experimental drug use might begin before they have any contact with the criminal justice system. For others, offending might predate drug use. However, research generally shows that offending rates often increase sharply after problematic drug use, particularly addiction to heroin or crack, develops.
The source breaks down the different ways drugs are linked to crime into 5 specific pathways. What are they?
Okay, 5 ways according to the source. First, and most prominently, users commit offenses, including potentially violent ones like robbery, primarily to fund their addiction, especially for expensive drugs like heroin and crack. However, this is often non-violent property crime or involvement in sex work.
Okay, funding the habit. What's second?
Second, drug use and other criminal behavior might simply co-occur because both are influenced by a common underlying third factor. This could be something like pre-existing mental health problems, an antisocial personality disorder, or shared environmental factors like homelessness or social exclusion.
Right. Third,
Violence associated with the drug trade itself. Drug dealers may use violence to protect their business interests, settle disputes over territory or debts, or intimidate rivals or customers. This seems to be increasingly likely, especially with organized crime involvement.
Fourth involves the direct effects of the drugs.
Yes, fourth is the direct psychoactive effect. The chemical alteration of the body and brain by the drugs directly affects behavior, potentially increasing aggression, paranoia or risk-taking, or impairing judgment. As mentioned, the specific effect depends heavily on the type and quantity of the drug consumed.
And the fifth way is quite different, involving the state.
Yes, the fifth way mentioned is more controversial. It's the suggestion, cited from Dorn and South, that there can sometimes be state involvement, direct or indirect, in the illegal drug trade itself. The specific example given is the recurring, though often disputed, claims that agencies like the CIA have been involved in facilitating or profiting from the illegal drug trade in the USA and elsewhere as part of geopolitical strategies, a much wider systemic link.
Okay, so we've covered all these biological theories, from genetics to brain function to biochemistry and substance use. Given that the biological positivist model sees criminality stemming from some kind of physical disorder or abnormality, the logical next step in this perspective is intervention aimed at treatment or cure.
Exactly. If you believe the cause is biological, the solution often proposed is a medical-style intervention aimed at fixing or managing that biological issue in the individual offender. The source briefly considers three main forms of such individualized treatment derived from this perspective: surgical intervention, chemotherapy, which means drug treatment in this context, and the more futuristic idea of electrocontrol.
Surgical intervention sounds pretty extreme. What did that involve?
It could be very extreme. One technique mentioned is the prefrontal leucotomy, more commonly known as the lobotomy. This involves surgically severing connections between the frontal lobes of the brain and the thalamus. It was known to cause profound character changes, often reducing anxiety and agitation, but also initiative and emotional range.
And it was used on criminals.
Yes, the source says it was used for some severe cases of schizophrenia, but also applied specifically to criminals deemed sexually motivated or spontaneously violent in attempts to control their behavior. It's now largely replaced by neuroleptic antipsychotic drugs due to its devastating side effects and ethical concerns.
Castration is also mentioned?
Yes, surgical castration has been used on convicted sex offenders in some countries, like Denmark, and historically in parts of the USA, with the aim of reducing sexual drive and reoffending. The source describes the results as indecisive. Stirrup, working in Denmark, claimed acceptable results in reducing recidivism. However, the Mueller case from the USA is cited as a counterexample, where a convicted rapist reportedly turned to child molesting and murder after being castrated, suggesting it didn't address the underlying issues.
Moving on to chemotherapy, using drugs not just for underlying conditions, but specifically for treatment and control of offenders.
Right. The source distinguishes between drugs aimed at treating specific patterns linked to crime and drugs used more purely for control. In the treatment category, it mentions blocking agents like antabuse, disulfiram for alcoholism, which makes people violently ill if they drink, or cyclozocine, used experimentally for heroin addicts to block the euphoric effects.
And drugs targeting sexual offending?
Yes, anti-libidinal drugs aimed at reducing sex drive have been used for sex offenders. Examples given are benperidol, a potent antipsychotic with anti-androgenic effects, and stilbostrol, a synthetic female hormone. These essentially constitute chemical castration.
And their use is ethically debated.
Intensely debated, especially when used on prisoners. Proponents often argue they should only be ethically used on genuine volunteers who give informed consent. But the source raises significant doubt about whether one can truly find free volunteers within the coercive environment of a prison. Can consent ever be truly free under such circumstances?
Plus, these drugs can have severe side effects themselves.
Very severe. Stilbostrol, the female hormone, is listed with a range of potential side effects, including atrophy, shrinkage of the genitals, development of female breasts, gynecomastia, nausea, general feminization of the body, obesity, and potentially serious psychiatric disorders. The cure can be worse than the problem.
Then there are the drugs used exclusively for control within institutions.
Yes, this is about managing behavior rather than treatment. Examples range from riot control agents like mace or CS gas used externally to sedatives and tranquilizers administered to prisoners internally, simply to keep those deemed troublesome, calm, and compliant. Historically, opium was sometimes used for this purpose.
And more recently.
In the contemporary UK prison system, drugs like Valium, diazepam, Librium, chlordiazepam, and Largactil, chlorpromazine, All benzodiazepines or older antipsychotics are mentioned as being commonly used. In the USA, a heavy-duty tranquilizer called Prolixin, flufenazine, has been used extensively.
What are its effects?
It's described as reducing hostility, anxiety, agitation, and hyperactivity, but often producing a zombie-like effect, severely dampening personality and initiative. And the potential side effects listed are truly alarming. Problems with automatic reactions, blurred vision, bladder paralysis, glaucoma, severe constipation, fecal impaction, rapid heartbeat, tachycardia, liver damage, skin disorders, and even in some cases, death.
And the source suggests these are used primarily for control.
It's quite blunt, stating such drugs have been used extensively in prisons solely to keep troublemakers quiet and maintain institutional order, regardless of therapeutic benefit or the severe risks involved, a chemical restraint.
The third intervention, electrocontrol, sounds even more dystopian.
It does, and the source indicates it remains largely in the research and development phase, primarily in the USA, rather than being widely implemented. The concept described is implanting a telemetric device either on or, more likely, inside a prisoner's body.
What would it do?
This device would continuously transmit data about the individual's physical state, heart rate, brain activity, etc., to a remote computer. The computer would analyze this data to assess their mental state and try to predict if an aggressive or criminal act was imminent.
And if it predicted an offense?
If the system determined a high risk, it could automatically send an electrical impulse back to a receiver implanted in the prisoner's brain or nervous system. The source suggests this impulse could have the potential to cause pain, temporary paralysis, or even, chillingly, death, to incapacitate the individual before they act.
The potential benefit cited for this technology is?
The argument put forward by proponents is that it could enable potentially dangerous offenders who would otherwise remain incarcerated for public safety to be released back into the community safely under constant monitoring and potential intervention.
But there are major obstacles.
Two main ones are highlighted. Firstly, the practical limitations, like the limited range of the transmission equipment currently available. And secondly, and perhaps more fundamentally, the enormous ethical concerns raised by civil liberty groups about the profound implications of such intrusive surveillance and the potential for remote control or harm by the state.
Right. So let's try to pull all of this together now. We've covered a huge range of theories and research across this chapter. What's the overarching argument?
The source argues that all the diverse theories discussed, from Lombroso's physical born criminal type right through to modern genetics, brain imaging, biochemistry, and even these futuristic control technologies, fundamentally follow the same underlying logic, the biological variant of the predestined actor model.
Meaning they all seek explanations for criminal behavior primarily within the organic makeup of the individual, their bodies, their brains, their internal chemistry.
Exactly. The assumption is that the cause lies within the biological person. And the source acknowledges it's impossible to completely deny that some of these biological factors or conditions might help explain the specific criminality of a tiny minority of offenders, perhaps those with very specific severe organic brain damage, or rare genetic syndromes, or extreme biochemical imbalances.
But that's a very small group. What's the crucial caveat?
The crucial caveat, emphasized repeatedly throughout the chapter's analysis, is that whenever researchers conduct closer, more rigorous investigation, social and environmental factors consistently emerge as being equally, if not often more, important in shaping behavior, even for those individuals with potential biological risk factors.
And even the biological positivists themselves came to recognize this.
Yes, the source makes the point that most researchers within this tradition, starting right back with Lombroso himself in his later work, increasingly came to recognize this complex reality, that biology rarely, if ever, acts in isolation. It interacts with the social world.
So, the pure biological positivist approach, viewing the scientist as this detached, objective observer discovering the natural laws of criminal behavior, led naturally to the idea that crime could be reduced or eliminated through treatment aimed at fixing the biological cause.
That was the core logic. Identify the biological flaw, treat the flaw, cure the crime. And this logic, as the source points out, then led fairly directly to the deeply troubling proposal to extend these investigations beyond convicted offenders to individuals merely deemed at risk based on supposed biological markers, allowing for intervention and treatment before they even had a chance to offend. Prophylactic intervention.
And the source views this whole perception of criminal behavior as simply a sickness to be cured as a fundamentally problematic analysis.
Yes. deeply problematic.
Yeah.
Because it led, historically, and potentially still could lead, to interventions and treatments that are highly intrusive, often unethical by today's standards, and have occasionally had horrendous wider social and political implications.
This conceptual shift, driven by early biological positivism, replacing the idea of the rational, choosing individual from classical criminology, with an organism driven by biological heredity and uncontrollable impulses, had consequences far beyond just how individual offenders were treated, didn't it?
Absolutely. The source argues that from this same intellectual tradition, or at least finding fertile ground within it, also emerged the ideology of social Darwinism.
Can you explain that briefly?
Social Darwinism was essentially the misapplication of Charles Darwin's biological evolutionary ideas, like survival of the fittest, to human societies, social structures, and behavior. It took scientific concepts and twisted them to justify social inequalities.
And this was compatible with biological positivism.
Highly compatible, the source argues, particularly with the interests of powerful groups in the wider world at the time, late 19th, early 20th century. It was used to provide a seemingly scientific veneer, a biological justification, for much older prejudices about the supposedly unequal capacity for rational judgment, moral behavior, and economic success among different races, social classes, and even between sexes.
It's disturbing to read the source detailing how prominent figures used these ideas to claim that certain groups, Africans, Indians, North American Negroes, the poor, criminals, even women had smaller brains or inferior biology, and therefore a reduced capacity for rational thought or moral conduct compared to, well, white European men, essentially.
Yes, these ideas were explicitly used to prop up existing social hierarchies and justify colonialism, racism, and sexism. They found particularly fertile ground, for example, in the USA during periods of significant immigration, where the biological concept of natural selection was easily, though wrongly, equated with unrestricted market competition and the idea that wealth and poverty reflected innate biological fitness.
And this led directly to advocating for programs like eugenics.
Directly. Programs of selective breeding and eugenics. The idea of improving the human race by encouraging reproduction among the fit and preventing it among the unfit were actively proposed and sometimes implemented in both Britain and the USA. The biological variant of positivism, with its focus on inherited criminal traits, was perfectly compatible with this agenda.
Goring, who did the early study on prisoners, actually recommended preventing reproduction.
Yes, the source states that Goring, convinced that criminality was primarily inherited, went so far as to recommend that people possessing characteristics deemed indicative of criminality should not be allowed to reproduce. Sterilization of the unfit. The source chillingly points out that the more recent, technologically advanced search for a single criminal gene carries some rather similar troubling implications if not handled with extreme ethical caution.
And these concerns aren't just historical relics. Recent developments show these ideas, or related ones, still surface.
The source suggests they haven't entirely disappeared. It mentions the establishment in 1994 of a Center for Social, Genetic, and Development Psychiatry in London, specifically tasked with examining the role of genetics in behavior, including crime. It also notes a closed conference held in 1995 that apparently discussed the feasibility of isolating a criminal gene based largely on the contested findings from twin and adoptee studies we discussed earlier.
And the controversy around the Bell Curve book in 1994.
Yes, that book by Herrnstein and Murray caused a huge storm by making controversial claims linking race, IQ, and social outcomes. They argued, for instance, that the overrepresentation of Black people and Latinos among the poor in the USA was partly due to genetically determined lower average intelligence. They suggested that low IQ, which they claimed was largely inherited, leads to a lack of foresight and impulse control, and thus contributes to higher rates of crime and other social problems, reviving those old, discredited links.
Muncie's observation about why such theories might remain attractive, despite the controversy, is quite pointed.
It is. He suggests, according to the source, that these biological or genetic theories remain appealing, at least to some segments of society, precisely because they seem to offer scientific evidence that neatly differentiates us, the law-abiding majority, from them, the criminal or deviant minority. It creates a seemingly legitimate basis for defining an outgroup that can then be targeted, controlled, outlawed, or even in the most extreme interpretations, eradicated.
Einstetter and Henry link this kind of argument to totalitarian regimes.
Yes, they note that this type of us versus them biological determinism is characteristic of the ideology found in totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany and the former USSR. They also argue it was extended, perhaps more subtly, to justify practices like forced therapy or medical interventions on unwilling subjects in the USA.
The source then raises the Holocaust as a profound crime of the 20th century that poses a significant challenge to the field of criminology itself.
Yes, Morrison observes, as cited in the chapter, that the Holocaust is often strangely absent or marginalized in standard criminology textbooks, despite being arguably the most horrific state-sponsored crime imaginable.
And the essential question it poses for criminology, according to the source.
Was the Holocaust a terrible, inexplicable aberration, completely at odds with the trajectory of modern civilization? Or, and this is the deeply unsettling part, was it, in some ways, a logical, albeit monstrous, consequence of certain projects and ways of thinking embedded within modernity? Projects like the biological variant of positivism, which sought to categorize, pathologize, and ultimately eliminate those deemed undesirable based on perceived biological or group differences. The source states there is strong evidence to support the latter, more disturbing interpretation.
Hannah Arendt's famous insight about the banality of evil is brought in here as irrelevant.
Yes, her observation, particularly from studying Adolf Eichmann, one of the key organizers of the Holocaust, was that it destroyed the comforting belief that immense evil must always be motivated by profoundly evil, monstrous people. She argued that most evil is done by people who never made up their mind to be either good or bad. It highlighted how ordinary individuals, bureaucrats, cogs in the machine, could become complicit in monstrous acts through conformity, careerism, or a simple failure to think critically and exercise moral judgment.
And Morrison's conclusion on the Holocaust connects it to this failure of individual judgment.
Yes, the source summarizes Morrison's view that the Holocaust can be explained in part by the weakness of individual judgment in the face of reason, in the face of the claims of organization, in the face of claims of the normal, in the face of claims for progress. It suggests the horrors were enabled not just by overt hatred, but by a collective deference to perceived expert authority, organizational imperatives, the pressure to conform, and seductive narratives of scientific or social progress, which allowed critical thinking and individual conscience to be overridden.
The outcome of this dark history, the source suggests, was a fundamental challenge to the previously unquestioned belief in expert authority, particularly scientific authority.
And it made it impossible for thinking people to simply take the promises of modernist civilization or the idea of automatic, unilinear progress towards a better future for granted anymore. The potential for progress to lead to barbarism was laid bare.
So the source reiterates that the biological variant of the predestined actor model, with its scientific claims and focus on innate deficiencies, directly contributed to making ideas like forced sterilization, genetic selection based on perceived fitness, and even death for those deemed biologically untreatable seem plausible, even rational to some.
Yes, and this logic, understandably, became deeply unpalatable for mainstream society after the world witnessed the horrors of mid-20th century mass extermination, based explicitly on group identity, whether that was ethnicity, sexuality, health status, or perceived behavioral deviance. The link between biological theories of difference and horrific outcomes became undeniable.
And while the source acknowledges there's a recent campaign of sorts to revisit and perhaps rehabilitate biological theories of crime, often with a more sophisticated interactionist understanding that recognizes the interplay between physical and social environments.
It concludes by emphasizing that the serious ethical implications surrounding potential treatment regimes or social policies derived from these ideas remain a significant concern. These issues haven't gone away just because the science is more advanced. And it notes this is a point that will be revisited again later in the book, specifically in Chapter 13. The source also points readers towards some suggested further reading for anyone wanting to delve deeper into these incredibly complex, fascinating, and often deeply troubling issues.
Wow, that really was a deep dive, charting the course of biological explanations for crime. We went all the way from Lombroso's rather crude ideas about physical-born criminal types,
right up through the complexities of genetic research, twin and adoption studies, theories about body types, brain function, neurology,
biochemistry, hormones, blood sugar, allergies, the impact of alcohol and drugs, and even those quite frightening potential treatment or control technologies.
And I think what really stands out from the source's account is this consistent pattern. While certain biological factors might, in isolation, play some role in the behavior of a very small fraction of individuals who commit crimes,
the evidence is nearly always complex, often riddled with methodological problems or potential biases.
And social and environmental factors are shown time and time again, upon closer inspection, to be equally, if not more, important in shaping who commits crime and why. Biology rarely tells the whole story.
And maybe more importantly, the history of how these biological ideas have been applied, or the logical conclusions drawn from them, leads us down a very, very dark path indeed. We saw connections to eugenics, justifications for racism and social inequality, disturbing links to authoritarian regimes, and even, chillingly, the role these ideas played in the context of the Holocaust.
Understanding this history isn't just an academic exercise, is it? It seems essential for us to approach modern biological research, especially in genetics and neuroscience, related to behavior, with a really critical eye. We need to be constantly aware of the potential for misuse and the possibility of repeating past mistakes if we aren't vigilant about the social and ethical implications.
It really leaves us with a profound question, one the source implicitly raises throughout this history. If the past record of biological positivism clearly shows us the dangers of reducing complex human behavior to simplistic biological causes, and the dangers of blindly trusting claims of scientific authority without critical scrutiny, how do we navigate today's incredible advancements in genetic and neurological science, which do offer insights into behavior without falling into those same traps?
Where is that ethical line? Especially when science suggests biological differences might genuinely influence behavior in some ways for some people, how do we use that knowledge responsibly without reinforcing inequality or enabling new forms of control?
A question that, as you say, continues to challenge us deeply.
It certainly does.